Dear colleagues, a very good day to you. C'est un grand plaisir de participer à cette conférence en Algérie, mais je ferai ma présentation en anglais. And I will do my very best to keep the presentation within the stipulated 8 or 10 minutes. And a more detailed account can be read in the conference proceedings. A lot of studies deal with the intersections between heritage tourism, economic development and marketing. And especially the 1990s saw an increase in this sort of research, which coincided with a boost in European regional funding programs. And probably more than elsewhere, the EU provided many case studies with measurable inputs, at least the financial ones, and some qualitative outputs, a situation that created a few important syntheses on heritage-based community building. And some of these outputs were classically econometric or managerial in nature, whereas others explored cultural and political and sociological dimensions as well, with a focus on the vertical relationships between tourism and cultural heritage, from the core concepts of authenticity, sustainability, commodification, and marketing. And so in short, the economic impacts of local heritage commodification have been studied at micro and regional level, and always come to the conclusion, or almost always come to the conclusion, that endogenous products, local products, and services are beneficial to the distinctiveness of a tourism mix. And so the assumption of local heritage creating economic development through tourism has become the backbone of national and regional cohesion plans. Globally, for instance, the UNWTO insists on the rise of a growing cultural heritage potential. And this sounds good, of course, but we need to keep in mind that tourism development and economic growth are not necessarily symmetrical. Indeed, empirical studies suggest that this is not always the case, and that economic performance depends on a combination of tourism production factors in the different national realities. A tourism growth correlation has, however, become a dogmatic policy-making principle. For small cities and towns, this often means a balance between more or less passive free riding on larger regional strategies on the one hand, and setting up the possible, the feasible municipal plans on the other. So it is in most cases hard, very difficult to cultivate a strongly distinctive local brand that is attractive at a supra-regional level. In the case of the United Arab Emirates, for instance, heritage components have been incorporated in all main development strategies at all levels, at Emirate, federal level, and the same happens in Portugal, both at the central and the municipal levels. But the fact is that consumers and providers really do not think of heritage as a controlled production unit, and rather as an unregulated asset, something that just exists on its own. And a major concern is that the production process itself is not well understood. Heritage is taken for granted, both as a concept and as an economic multiplier, but only when conveniently commodified or monetized, if you want. And so many studies do demonstrate the successful integration of cultural tangibles and intangibles in the tourism product. A museum, an archaeological site, a culinary festival, or a historical city center naturally enriches the leisure experience for a visitor, for a tourist. And this is an intuitive conclusion, but also empirically verifiable to a certain extent, and has generated this idea that you find all around the world, this idea of massive contributions to national GDPs. And for decades, this has led to the injection of public monies into heritage in virtually all regions with coherent development plans. And the subjacent principle is that financially stimulating forms of local identity leads to community engagement and then to grassroots entrepreneurship and ultimately to a better distribution of heritage-based wealth production. And so this sort of fisherman's cane makes sense and has proven useful in the product enhancement, but the resulting ecosystems become self-sufficient only with great difficulty. And very often they create operational challenges, operational structures that remain deeply dependent on public subsidies. Becomes very visible in Oliveira das Azeméis, which is a municipality in the Porto metropolitan area in northern Portugal. A medium-sized city, it has an essentially uncharacteristic image of heritage and tourism in terms of integration of the tourism mix. For instance, very few people will associate Oliveira das Azeméis with a specific heritage component that is unique enough to be distinctive or brandable at a larger than local level. Heritage conservation has been at the center of successive municipal directives, namely in the field of archaeological excavation, for instance, archaeological integration in the tourism product. So despite certain lack of distinctiveness, Oliveira das Azeméis does count on its own heritage tourism offer, in particular the La Salette Park, the Ferreira de Castro Museum, and the Mill Park at Ul. And this latter, the picture you see in the middle there, the Watermill Park, has been marketized based on a number of restored mills that symbolize traditional activities, especially the ones connected to local bread produce, so typical bread. And this gastronomic specialty can be tasted and bought, is presented as a unique local product. La Salette, on its turn, associates a religious and leisure dimension to a hilltop park with a neo-Gothic chapel and a religious festival that has created steady dynamics of tourism attraction. The figure of the writer Ferreira de Castro is a third branded element, and theoretically his museum and literary work, of course, may be transformed into a niche product in terms of tourism. As for the archaeological heritage, it has not been heavily commodified. Some sites are visitable and they are accessible by public road. And the most well-known of these is Uld, adjacent to the Watermill Park, which confers an interesting potential for a day trip. So, briefly, the present and prospective elements of heritage attraction are authentic and relevant, but they yield only moderate rates of return. To assess the effectiveness of the full branded image through the lens of a potential international visitor attraction, there were a couple of studies were conducted. The first one was a survey on 62 respondents having visited European destinations but not Portugal before, and they provided their feedback. The majority either strongly agreed or agreed on statements about Oliveira das Azeméis offering distinctive cultural experiences, comparatively less expensive cultural experiences, being a safe and comfortable cultural destination, and the expectation of heritage attractions being a major part of the tourism experience. Looking at the results, there seems to be a favorable yet undefined perception on Oliveira das Azeméis as a tourism destination, cultural heritage tourism destination. In other words, there is no fundamentally negative opinion and also no specific remarkableness of other sorts of pull factor. A fine-tuning of these responses was done qualitatively through short interviews and confirmed two main impressions. On the one hand, local cultural heritage is a factor for international tourists, and on the other, smaller destinations lack distinctiveness for those same international tourists to build expectations on. So the primary focus for Oliveira das Azeméis is not international, and it is the domestic market that remains central, as one infers from most markers. TripAdvisor feedback, for instance, reveals an almost complete domestic nature of visitors. Some reviews written in English come from Portuguese and even local residents, the latter presumably attempting to encourage and stimulate their city's tourism. Another indicator is the result of a questionnaire to local residents with the purpose of maturing the municipal plan. And what stood out was the significant hesitation or unfamiliarity with local cultural resources. Further questions did confirm a lack of awareness of specific heritage components, despite the majority of these respondents stating heritage is important to their local community, namely in terms of tourism. This, however, seems to remain an abstract principle and more than a clear take on how such importance would actually become a reality or materialize. In a very, very dissimilar environment, Al Ain is an inland city in the Emirate of Abu Dhabi, offers completely different heritage resources and faces other geographical development challenges in terms of cultural heritage and their development strategies. Its cultural sites are inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List and include a combination of oases and archaeological elements. Both the UNESCO classification and also, by the way, the criteria for the FAO, Globally Important Agriculture Heritage System, have a considerable impact on development of territories such as that of Al Ain. In fact, investment in this local heritage from the perspective of sustainable integrations has been deemed important and immediately recognizable from the consumer side through a handful of distinctive iconic resources. And this means forts, gardens, a mountain, Jebel Hafid, and oasis. And so the desert scenario in itself provides a uniqueness for heritage tourism development, and it includes even a zoo with increasing satisfaction levels. The city image of Al Ain is a construct that includes tourist attractions as an immediate cognitive reality, but also as an emotional one, interlaced with local quality of life, residential infrastructures, and others, for instance. From this angle, investing in positive heritage experience around attractive areas, Al Ain National Museum has the central oasis close to it or adjacent to it, the green Mubazara on the slope of Jebel Hafid, the geological and archaeological features. All of this is a definite factor for socio-cultural development. The Abu Dhabi Department of Culture and Tourism includes a number of Al Ain heritage attractions in its strategic vision. The Al Jahli Fort, for instance, is viewed as both a historical structure and a venue for cultural activity. Substantial investment has been made at the local World Heritage components, with more than 140,000 visitors to the sites, which is a fraction of the visitors that come to Abu Dhabi or to Dubai, and the creation of a desert park combining heritage with outdoor a straightforward but unprocessed way, if you want, to tap into some level of visitor experience is the feedback on sites such as TripAdvisor, again, or others, similar sites or similar platforms. Despite all the issues regarding, or the warnings regarding online comments, whether or not they are representative, the main idea is that the park has tipped more towards family leisure activities and is perhaps less appealing an asset to the occasional Western visitor with a predefined idea of what an archaeological park means. And this is an issue that is totally unrelated to the quality of the scientific research or to the World Heritage criteria. Feedback ranges from 5 to 2 stars for different reasons, and the least encouraging ones have to do mainly with preconceptions and projections by first-time visitors on what an archaeological park is expected to look like, as opposed to consumer patterns evidenced by returning visitors who seek leisure setting and not just like cafeterias and gift shops, something you see very often in the museum industry as well. So to commodify a site is to make tough choices always, not only on preservation, but especially on what we can call the packaging, that is the product to integrate a tourism mix. This will always please certain segments more than others, and in the case of Hilly, the strategic choice is to favor a local leisure integration that ends up creating a tension with non-residents and their expectations. And the challenge for DCT Abu Dhabi is to balance both dimensions by exploring complementary services that may satisfy international centric oriented tourism demand as much as community life. And so the overlapping message here is that heritage becomes sustainable only by letting it transform, by allowing new meanings to otherwise pointless objects and spaces. We cannot and we should not attempt to obsessively preserve cultural elements as if they were part of some external world. And if by using them instead, we change them in the process, well, that is okay. This is the way heritage becomes economically sustainable instead of. Strategic options for heritage-based differentiation are limited and should be stimulated through collaborative communication. The operational dimension for a small administrative unit and the ensuing success is limited to the supra-regional level. Micro-scale analysis based on car travel within a few dozens of kilometers fail to correctly identify preferences related to extended family dispersion, hospitality specifics and place of residence of regional visitors. In the Portuguese case, consistent communication campaigns are mainly generated by Turismo do Norte, the regional tourism board, in an attempt to provide coherence to an essentially very dispersed heritage supply. Oliveira das Azeméis is geographically much closer to Aveiro, which is considered central Portugal, than it is to Porto, administratively located in the north. A visitor of Oliveira das Azeméis might more easily start or end their day in Aveiro, mid-sized city as well, close to the coast, with which the landscape has more affinity and continuity than in Porto. Similarly, Alain is a city in Abu Dhabi, but is slightly closer to Dubai than to the capital city. It is also a border city with the Sultanate of Oman, and the distance to the Omani coastal city of Sohar on the west coast of the Arabian Peninsula is in fact even smaller than to Dubai, but the administrative and geographical discontinuities represent interruptions in the coherence of an experience. And so this is not measured in physical distance, but in perceived units. So it's not about how far it is, but how easy you reach it and how coherent the landscape is. I'm looking at the time here. I'm perhaps going to move forward a bit more. And basically, this next slide is about correctly dimensioning cultural supply. And it calls for appropriate data, of course, and more upstream, even the factors that produce the data. And these factors are less volatile than you and I might presume, and they relate to long-standing social structures, leisure habits, education, and other demographics that generate parameters that are hard to alter. You cannot change them very easily. And they configure the community dynamics. And these community dynamics are precisely what makes heritage, what makes a destination unique. So what cultural heritage is or not, and what it can do and cannot be used for, depends on the context, on the specific context that you are working on. And some degree of international distinctiveness would depend on a very specific niche experience that in the best case scenario may result in only marginal demand. And so you can build a niche product, but it might not yield enough return on investment or a satisfactory return. So to finish this presentation, I'm taking quite some time. I apologize in advance. A couple of final ideas. Despite the large differences between theory and practical applications in a specific municipality, some common principles can be identified. So first and foremost, cultural heritage generates indirect and induced effects in the local economy. Everybody agrees on that. And part of this revenue can be reinjected in the heritage sector through private initiatives, conservation of natural and built heritage, or the social well-being and the local pride that ultimately enhances the quality of intangible heritage. Second point, municipal heritage promotes a uniqueness that depends on factors that are supra-municipal, on a framework that you do not control, roads, airport infrastructures, the success of national tourism agency campaigns, competing attractions as well, heritage and non-heritage in nature, and many of the production factors are not controllable by local ambition only. Finally, the heritage resources that function as building blocks for development need to be valued by local communities in the first place before any marketing investment may generate a quality return. If such a primitive, primal connection does not exist, the very concept of heritage becomes perverted, even if archaeological sites or historical performance are well commodified. Heritage always requires a social articulation with local dynamics, which is why outreach and education need to focus on local realities more even than on the prospective tourists. And thank you very much for listening. It was a pleasure presenting these ideas on heritage, on local tourism development from the municipal perspective. And I'm leaving our email addresses should you wish to comment on any of our observations. And again, I apologize for slightly taking more time than I was supposed to. Thank you very much.